Today is very exciting. We have our very own Nataya to join us to give us the colloquium lecture. Nataya is a postdoctoral associate in urban climate mitigation and adaptation at the Cornell Muir Center for Cities. And she is a social anthropologist whose work focuses on climate adaptation and misinformation in North American cities. Her current book project, titled Selling Swampland to Yankees, is about the political life of scientific evidence in Houston, Texas, an oil industry town experiencing climate change impacts. Her ethnography follows business people, politicians, residents, and activists as they renegotiate the economic concept of externality in the day-to-day processes of planning flood infrastructure. Nataya's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Wenner Green Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Nataya.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted for this opportunity to share my work with you, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you in the Q&A. I would like to thank Dang for coordinating the speaker series, inviting me to participate, and for that generous introduction. My talk today draws from my current book project, Selling Swampland to Yankees, which is an ethnography set in Houston, Texas, about the political life of climate change evidence in an oil industry town, as you heard. It joins a growing literature in anthropology on climate adaptation practices, as well as urban infrastructure. Drawing on 18 months of fieldwork with engineers, businessmen, and government officials in Houston between 2018 and 2020, I argue that the central falsehood I found was not climate change isn't real, but a more tightly held belief that fuel is cheap. In my talk today, there will be no regression line that proves fuel is not cheap, and no map that shows hotspots of denialists per census tract. Instead, I draw on 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork to show that climate denial is a refusal to look backwards as much as forwards. It is a labor of forgetting that the claim fuel is cheap relies upon. So I'm going to get right into it. On March 5th, 2020, just before human subjects research stopped due to the coronavirus, I was looking out the 45th floor window of an influential energy analyst's office in downtown Houston. I'll call her Stephanie. She was sniffling and speaking of just getting off an international flight. Stephanie admitted, I was a burn baby burn person. She pointed out across Houston's flat landscape to show me storage tanks in the distance. She explained, I live by the water and I drive by there on my way to work every morning. I used to smell them and think to myself, that's the smell of money being made. She smiled before recounting to me how she recently started saying, there are no climate deniers anymore. How recently, I asked, and she yelled out to her secretary, when did I start saying there were no climate deniers anymore? Stephanie could not land on a specific date, but she narrowed the extinction of climate denial to the last few months. As I tried to pin her down on her own understanding of the connection between more and worse storms and greenhouse gas emissions, she cut me off at warmer temperatures in the Gulf's nonlinear relationship to higher volumes of precipitation to say, I'm not troubled by the science. Stephanie added that she didn't really care about all the details. It's here, it's happening, those tanks don't smell like money anymore. Of course, the oil and gas industry had been having trouble with the science. The burn baby burn people, or major oil and gas companies, had spent decades pouring money into misinformation campaigns about climate change, often using analysts like Stephanie as preachers and organizations like the American Petroleum Institute as pulpits. As Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway wrote in Merchants of Doubt, oil industry misinformation campaigns were modeled after tobacco and sometimes executed by the same professionals. These public relations campaigns sowed doubt in scientific consensus, targeting the causal linkages between industrial action and industrial harm. During my fieldwork in Houston, businessmen and women like Stephanie would often refer to outright denialists as dinosaurs. But when I met these dinosaurs, such as the men gathered with the Oilfield Christian Fellowship, whose mailer is here, they didn't seem to be holding the reins of climate refusal. Sure, until March of 2021, this was in their mailer, and I found propaganda at oil museums, such as the one in Midland, which suggested that without fossil fuels, we would become cave people. And there was certainly greenwashing at major industry events. This is at NAPE in February of 2020. Where there was a lot of environmental imagery and slogans, but no mention of climate change specifically. what I explored in Houston and across Texas was a range of denialist claims, from the fellowship mailer to the more ubiquitous claim, just another wet cycle. And that's to say that sure, these storms are bad and they seem once in a lifetime, but really this is a natural fluctuation. So I challenge you as you're listening to this talk to think about if you're worried about the science. Do you care about all the details? This is the IPCC saying with high confidence that anthropogenic climate change has contributed to extreme precipitation associated with recent intense hurricanes, such as Hurricane Harvey in 2017. But it's actually quite complicated science to describe exactly how and why. And if you feel like you already know, you should probably go over to the hard sciences because they're trying to figure it out. But there's some things that are more straightforward, and there is this larger high-level consensus. So that first summer in 2018, I sat in coffee shops and strip malls with oil and gas professionals whose leases and loans stretch out into the future decades they claimed not to be responsible for. Any empirical claim about climate change refers to around 40 years of measured change, and ground leases for oil and gas development range from 30 to 99 years. It is an industry based off of large infrastructure investments and long-term production schedules. Present-day wealth in Houston is based off of distant futures calculated through projected values. Industrial speculation is all about coordinating complicated global relationships spanning great distances and across variant political and geographic contexts. Yet many of these industry professionals refuse to accept that they could even have an opinion. Across coffee cups, I said, warmer temperatures in the Gulf mean when a hurricane passes over, it picks up more water. And civil engineers, geophysicists, and chemists acted like I, a social anthropologist, had something to teach them about physics. The phrase I heard most often that summer was, "I'm not an expert." Over the next 2 years, I focused on flood infrastructure planning, spending 6 months embedded at Harris County Flood Control District, which I'll call flood control. But I kept doing interviews and attending gatherings in oil and gas because the industry loomed heavily in the silences. During my fieldwork, NOAA and IPCC reports attributing rain events to greenhouse gas emissions were circulating Houston. But in spite of scientific consensus and data specific to the Gulf Coast, many leaders in Houston City and Harris County government, as well as the business community, were calling the storms just another wet cycle, as they planned large-scale infrastructure in response. It is this claim that I followed ethnographically and archivally. On a Thursday morning in August of 2018, I sat in a hotel conference room for a breakfast panel discussion on green infrastructure hosted by the West Houston Association, a developers group responsible for the city's recent westward expansion along Interstate 10. City officials had intentionally taken the bus for an hour and a half to prove that the 10-minute drive from downtown took 9 times as long by public transportation. So I can't actually see that map, but that's where downtown to I-10 would be. Real estate developers sat by firm at round conference tables eating a meaty buffet breakfast. The panel featured 2 developers, an engineer, and Jim Blackburn, a notoriously outspoken local environmental lawyer who had been suing many of the developers in the room since the 1970s. All the panel questions had been vetted, but the self-proclaimed hatchet thrower Blackburn predictably went off script. Quote, "I'm going to call out the 800-pound gorilla in the room." He then spoke about the energy transition and asked a question about climate change. As soon as Blackburn said climate change, loud boardroom-style laughter filled the conference hall. No one answered, and no one broached the topic again. Mikhail Bakhtin wrote in his analysis of the role of laughter in fiction, quote, "In the comic world, there is nothing for memory and tradition to do. One ridicules in order to forget." The developers' laughter was not a unique response. As my interviews in the private sector continued, the most common initial response when I broached the topic of climate change was a joke at my or the speaker's expense. I found myself mixing metaphors in my notes, sometimes elephants and sometimes gorillas in rooms, and hearing others mix metaphors in their speech throughout my fieldwork observations. The 800-pound gorilla is from a joke. Where does the 800-pound gorilla sit in a room? Anywhere he wants. In this instance, the gorilla is the oil and gas industry, which still represents half of Houston's economy. The elephant in the room would be climate change or the energy transition, 2 entwined existential threats for Houston. I offer my own spin on another riddle. How do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time. This one is meant to express that large abstract concepts should be unpacked piece by piece, or complex political problems should be chipped away at bit by bit. Climate obstinance is not exclusively the result of a misunderstood environmental problem, but a misunderstood political problem. Seeing climate denial as a failure to look backwards as much as forwards offers alternate strategies for framing climate action. I offer, instead of learning how to eat the elephant, learn how to eat the gorilla. This is what my current book project, Selling Swampland to Yankees, seeks to do. There are dinosaurs in Texas, but what I found ethnographically was that any disbelief in climate change was secondary to a belief in the magic of the market. The phrase that rang clear and earnest that I aimed to deconstruct was, "Fuel is cheap." Throughout my book, I chip away at the veracity of this central claim by showing the beliefs of market fundamentalism contorted and exposed by the stresses of local climate change impacts and the global energy transition. Essentially, I consider the concept of externality ethnographically. Since my 18 months of fieldwork ended in the fall of 2020, the conservative county officials that I spent time with have gone back into the local engineering firms, and more liberal commissioners have put in leadership at flood control more aligned with their climate action plans. My fieldwork captured a window in time where individuals at opposite ends of the political spectrum tried to act on climate change in concert, whether they believed in it or not. On Tuesday, September 17th, 2019, the office manager was giving me a tour of flood control at the beginning of 6 months of participant observation and archival work. The field guys wanted to show me their shiny new red drones that could land on floodwaters and collect real-time data. One of them said, "You should come out with us. We're supposed to be getting some rain this week." I was also invited to be in the county's version of the Situation Room on that Thursday, but tropical depression Imelda caught even flood control employees off guard, with some of them stranded on opposite ends of the county from their own cars. It wasn't safe to get into mine on Thursday morning, and I watched from my apartment window on Hazard Street, just north of Rice University, as the water pummeled the concrete. I watched on my laptop at the county rain gauges as the numbers rose beyond what Houston's infrastructure could bear. I watched news footage of floodwaters blasting through the retaining wall of the highway I lived above, a couple exits away. Though Hurricane Harvey was the wettest tropical storm in U.S. history by documented rainfall, Imelda was 7th and barely made national headlines. It wasn't even still designated as a storm when it hit Houston, only a tropical depression due to decelerating wind speeds. In the following weeks, I combed the flood control archives for evidence of precipitation rates of the magnitude I had seen on the rain gauges during Imelda and in the flood reports after Harvey. I read through flood control reports for every major storm since its founding in the 1930s. Glenn Laird, who had been working for decades in the planning department, provided me with his own color-coded spreadsheet monitoring the same question. This is his color-coded map, monitoring a different history, but same author, enumerating more and worse. There were clustered catastrophic floods, including the series in the 1930s that led to flood control's founding, but even considering the less technical measurement of those times, it wasn't close. It was 13 to 18 inches over 2 days, comparable to the current series where 40 to 60 inches dropped over 2-day periods during Harvey and Imelda. I saw evidence of catastrophic storm surges and violent winds in pictures of property destruction and lines on bridges documented in old flood reports and local news archives. I saw evidence of intense precipitation rates that would be wild in Philadelphia or San Francisco, but not the volume of precipitation documented with Harvey or Imelda across any interval from 30 minutes to 2 days. Many still claim this was just another natural fluctuation in the severity of storms, including flood control leadership. The first time I visited flood control in 2018, an executive pointed at a poster representing all the storms that had hit Houston. He pointed at the 1930s and other peaks to convince me that this was just another wet cycle, and that if I knew flooding like he knew flooding, I would see that. Though he saw me as a sensationalist outsider, he was patient with my climate change questions and let me bother him for the next year and a half. We shared an intellectual curiosity across our political differences, and he respected that I was interested in hard science around climate change, that I had taken a physics class, not just climate modeling, which he mistrusted. When I first visited his office, he pulled out a paper map he had salvaged as the archives were being digitalized. He liked the craftsmanship of past modes of representation and the historical insight they allowed for. In the last weeks of my 6 months embedded at flood control, I asked him how many storms it would take for him to think this was something different than just another wet cycle. He thought, and then looked at me in the eyes and said, 10. Here, he is not only deciding whether to believe in climate change or not, but to make sense of it within the modes of knowledge production that he feels comfortable in. An engineer, he wanted a number, a threshold, some form of measurable clarity. So when I asked him the climate question in terms of a threshold, it was the first time he answered without a joke about liberal elites. With trust built, he said, write whatever you want, just don't make me look like an idiot. One disastrous weather event is not climate change, but neither is a cluster of 10 outside of historical context. Climate change attribution is inherently a historical claim. Some of the staunchest climate skeptics were at the highest levels of county governance on the front lines of responding to and preparing for more and worse floods. By the time of my 6 months at flood control beginning in the fall of 2019, NOAA had put out a report known as Atlas 14 that included new climate data on precipitation rates affecting the Gulf Coast and therefore Houston. The takeaway from the new data was a 30% increase in precipitation rates, such that the 500-year flood zone was effectively now the 100-year flood zone, even though the new FEMA maps are just coming out 6 years later. An executive at flood control began a meeting in early 2020 by calling Atlas 14 the worst case scenario, drawing on industry-funded doubt campaign strategy of undercutting the bottom end of any risk projection. At flood control, I was told in no uncertain terms by a sympathetic manager, quote, we don't talk about climate change here. Or more gently by another employee in front of his boss, at flood control, the weather is so bad in Houston, we try to keep it light. Sorry. In 2019, a major county official smirked as soon as I neared the topic of climate change. Quote, not one Google, he said. He expressed that he was ready to go to bat for the latest NOAA data on behalf of the county, but for the sake of peace in his private life, he refused to Google climate change and therefore had no personal thoughts on the matter. He suggested that he was more afraid of his dining room table than the biggest developers in town. A flood control employee who went out and shared the news that the county would be enforcing the latest NOAA data as, quote, best available data was possibly the most conservative person I interviewed, with a deep mistrust of political others associated with the climate change conversation. When he moved to Houston, he and his family lived in a friend's underground bunker for weeks, and he continued to live on the outskirts of the county in the woods in a house he built where his wife homeschooled their children. To say he was skeptical of liberals is an understatement. He made fun of the words climate change in our interview until I pointed out they were coined by Republican George H.W. Bush. When he was walking away from our interview, he started trying to tell me not to share some of what he had said. But then he changed course with a smile. Quote, it's okay. Say whatever you want. I'll just deny I said any of it. Another thing that had changed in 2019 was the elected political leader of the county judge, progressive Lina Hidalgo, had taken over county leadership and explicitly directed these same county officials to act on climate change evidence. When I interviewed then Executive Director of Flood Control Russ Poppe on the record in April 2020 over the phone, he still expressed tobacco industry-framed climate skepticism. He expressed doubt in the consensus in scientific community, referring to the 30% change in 500-year events identified in the Atlas 14 report. He asked, is this cyclical, permanent, 10 years, 15 years? Well, 17 inches or 18 and a half. That's the level of detail in the conversations that I don't see. It's difficult to plan for presumptive precipitation rates. That 17 to 18 and a half refers to the regulations of developers and that type of building. Here he was making a just another wet cycle type claim, but he was also trying to figure out what County Judge Lina Hidalgo's directive meant. I witnessed county leadership mocking Judge Hidalgo behind her back, but I also witnessed them try to figure out a way to move towards a shared goal across vast ideological differences. More practically, Poppe went on, private property rights are pretty supreme in Texas. He was worried about being sued. Those who were figuring out what acting on climate change evidence meant and ensuring that private developers acted too were not necessarily climate warriors. What could be considered climate action happened in the mundane day-to-day practices of enforcement of county-level procedural law that developers had to incorporate best available data. Those who were pushing for this change were refusing private consumption of climate change evidence. and public speech, but not public action upon climate change evidence. The avoidance of the words climate change and the connection between oil and worse storms were more about the distribution of pain and gain. As one retired oil and gas professional put it to me over coffee, we're not fighting for Earth, but our place in it. In early February 2020, the Dallas-based owner of a golf course in the Cypress Creek neighborhood, the golf course is called Ravenout Country Club, approached flood control to sell the golf course for the county to put in a flood detention basin. There was a Houston Chronicle article in the morning, and by the time the Cypress Forest Public Utility District Board met on March 3rd, a lot more had been said on Nextdoor and by email. The residents of the area were up in arms to save their golf course from condemnation, only they didn't own the golf course. As one speaker summarized, reading Nextdoor, talking to neighbors, the narrative is the same, even if the tenor goes up and down. Property values. Others were more accusatory. What's the precedent for one municipality to take from another municipality? The speaker continued, "We're at the grill the other day," and described his neighbors agreeing with him that there has to be an economic solution within the neighborhood that doesn't destroy the neighborhood. He claimed, as his voice raised, that the county is not going to be able to tell me where the water goes. And he ended with the conclusion, dredge these channels. So this is Cypress Creek. Which would be a solution to the local flooding problem within the local jurisdiction. This comment was followed by applause. I thought of all the modeling they're doing at flood control, trying to be able to tell people where the water goes. I thought of Atohanan, the chief environmental planner at flood control, walking out during Hurricane Harvey into 3 feet of water, trying to feel what amount of water could take a life, and then set evacuation policies to that measurement. The room in Cypress Creek was packed tight, around 60 people, mostly white and mostly older. Several of the speakers admitted they did not play golf, and one of them said frankly, "Some of you aren't golfers, but you drive by and it's beautiful, guaranteed, brings values." Someone who identified as the mom in the neighborhood noted that she was not a golfer, but she wanted to conserve and preserve trees. She called herself an environmentalist, mentioning trees and deer and green, but landed again on the refrain of private property. No one else in Houston has what we have anymore, our green space and our trees. I would love to see an environmental impact study of clear-cutting thousands of trees. She riffed about ecosystems and then landed again on property values. After she said property values again and concluded there was another round of applause, and she had riled the crowd. Why don't we just dredge the creek? Because it'll flow into Houston, and they don't want. Too bad. Occasionally, a board member or a local flooding activist tried to temper these conversations with facts and figures and calm conversations, but the sentiment that the majority of residents were expressing is important. Quote, "Huge imbalance between pain and gain. Gain is for people down yonder and not us. For us, pain." Applause again followed. Flooding doesn't obey census tracts, property lines, municipal utility districts, or county jurisdictions, but residents sought solutions to their flooding problem within the bounds of land they identified as their own, and water challenged this relationship. During my fieldwork, there was a perception amongst civil society groups that the federal risk maps were the mechanism of racial disparity and the impacts of disaster. As anthropologist Roberto Barrios and his team showed in their ethnography of flood victims in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, other academics used quantitative methods to support these claims by saying, look at these homes that were flooded during Hurricane Harvey that were outside the risk maps, and this gained traction in the New York Times. The issue is that the vast majority of structures damaged during Hurricane Harvey were built before 1980, before the first FEMA maps were drawn, in the direct way of FEMA employees being bribed or pressured to draw different lines on a map meant to determine insurance rates. The FEMA maps were not the site of corruption, to my knowledge. But in another way, the civil society groups are identifying that racial disparities in the impacts of disasters are driven in part by federal agencies, tools, and procedures. This type of inequality can only be understood by considering the past. As I drove through Independence Heights from the golf course that rainy day, I saw all these smaller houses sitting low and pooling water so easily and cheaply, propping up on stilts if the money could be made to move that way. The small wooden houses were developed by the Wright Land Company in the early 1900s, built by Black contractors for Black residents, but the logic for neighborhoods with lower property values was not to prop up old houses, but to buy them out in a process of managed retreat. Independence Heights is a historically Black neighborhood that was cut off by 2 highways, I-45 and the 610 loop. It was the first city incorporated by African Americans in the state of Texas. Because neighborhoods with majority Black residents were historically redlined and victimized by hazardous infrastructure siting in the 20th century, as well as not served by flood infrastructure, property values are depressed in the 21st. These past inequities are amplified by major flood infrastructure projects and policies based on property value, whether bureaucrats are personally discriminatory or not. All large infrastructure projects that take federal funds have been subject to the benefit-cost ratio of the Army Corps of Engineers. This is not specifically a problem with Texas values. Highways slicing through Black neighborhoods, floodplain development, and racial disparities in the impacts of disaster in and around Houston are driven in large part by federal policies, from the Army Corps' use of the benefit-cost ratio to federal flood insurance processes. Residents of the Cypress Creek suburb were weaponizing a free market ideology based on the sanctity of private property against a free and willing sale of by the golf course owner in Dallas. They claimed to be victims of government seizure for the benefit of their downstream neighbors, but at the same time, activists from Independence Heights and academics had long claimed the opposite, that upstream development and infrastructure siting benefiting wealthier suburban neighbors was the cause of downstream losses to floodwaters during storms. During my fieldwork, Independence Heights activist Tanya DuBois was trying to get the neighborhood marked as a heritage site to protect it from further infrastructural violence. In the environmental justice literature, as well as my own interviews and observations, I found many precedents for one municipality taking from another through infrastructure siting. As more and worse rain events hit the industrial city, residents negotiated upstream and downstream relationships, accusing each other and the government of theft through the management of water. When I asked Texas Southern University professor and environmental justice advocate Friedan Nance about why no one in Houston would say climate change in public, she said, pointing to an ally in city government and referencing civil society groups, "We've been talking about climate change." A few weeks later, she answered my question differently when speaking on the public record at a commissioner's court meeting. On July 27th, a New York Times article had come out touching on many of the topics of my research, with quotes from many of my interlocutors. On July 28th, the following day, the Commissioner's Court deliberated the proposed structure of a community resilience task force. There were extensive public comments, and speaking to a different audience, Dr. Nance spoke about whether Harris County could be a model for the country by demonstrating a more equitable approach to flood control using the prioritization factors that Judge Hidalgo's office developed for the major post-Harvey flood bond. She spoke about how there is an opportunity to do work that, quote, brings our region into the modern era. Then she said, quote, climate change, sea level rise, and land use, these are controversial because acknowledging them disrupts the status quo. Nance went on to argue that to acknowledge them is to acknowledge the entrenched systems of privilege, Houston's layered inequalities. She argued that these controversial words would require that those in power remedy the harms done. She warned in conclusion of her 3 minutes aloud, quote, the New York Times and others are watching us from the outside and here at home. Dr. Nance's comments showed how the climate change-related speech injured beyond the oil and gas industry into the social hierarchies built around it. A month after Imelda, on October 17th, 2019, Chief Environmental Planning Officer at Flood Control, Atul Hanan, spoke at a Rice University conference about, quote, dynamic changes in nature, being a different issue than that the new FEMA maps would not address. Quote, no one is going to hug us when the new maps come out, he said. Civil society groups have focused heavily on the corruption of the maps, and I agree that the maps are outdated and wrong. Most would. The federal government is slow, and the maps are vehicles of distribution, but not in the sense of local corruption alone. Over the next 6 months, I got to know Atul, who agreed to let me identify him with his quotes from our interviews. Those who didn't are all pseudonyms. When I met Atul, he was tired of being lectured by tourist academics and Hurricane Harvey ambulance chasers who did not know what watersheds were and represented obvious or inaccurate conclusions based on outdated or irrelevant data. At first, he came off as condescending in his frustration, perhaps rightfully so, but he was not a climate denier. He was not skeptical of climate change research, and he never spoke in tobacco industry phrases. Atul just did not have any interest in chatting with people about their beliefs, fancy liberal academics like me, or conservative county officials in neighboring Pearland whom he implied rejected Atlas 14 data because they saw it as climate change sensationalism. Atul absolutely never said that he was not an expert. When I asked Atul in early 2020 about a Living with Water report that the Dutch group had just put out, He was dismissive. Quote, "I know the Dutch." He reminded me how one of his master's degrees was in Rotterdam, that the Dutch also knew his dad, who worked in water resource management in Bangladesh, and for UNESCO. He went on to explain, quote, "All Dutch data is from Bangladesh," pointing out the data is from 268 real rivers, 17 miles wide. Atul found the Dutch example relatively unhelpful since it came from a very different environment than Houston, both literally and politically. But he appreciated that the Dutch give a lot of attention to how to live with nature, building to the 1,000-year level of service. Atul explained that Harris County barely does a 15-year level of service. In fact, 62% of Harris County gets less than a 5-year level of service. To translate, those areas will flood in 4 inches of rain, and major rain events in recent years have dumped 40 to 60 inches in 2 to 3 days. Atul recounted to me how his dad often said, quote, "A river is a living thing. If you don't treat it well, it's just a matter of time. It will remember very well." Back in his own voice, he explained, "Here we just dreamed it would never happen. I looked at all the hurricane paths in the United States when I worked at FEMA in DC. In many places, people were surprised, but if you look back on the map 110 years or so, you'll find the same hurricane path. We are now experiencing so much damage because we never look back at history. The failure he saw was to look backwards, not forwards. Here, living with water means knowing its history." Atul spoke of the river as living and remembering, but these vitalist claims were inextricably linked to the highest level of hydrological and hydraulic research across continents, along the sinews of knowledge production about water management from Bangladesh to the Netherlands to Houston. Atul knew how floods have changed over time and space more practically and empirically than anyone I have ever met, and yet he was not that interested in climate change attribution. When I pressed him in our final interview on the question of inequality, he told me a story about casinos in Nevada as an answer. He told me the casinos are insured. They can ignore past flooding because if it happens to them, they will be able to recover their losses. The workers making a life for themselves are not insured against the loss of home and livelihood. They are planning along different timelines, and their losses in plans and relationships are never fully protected. The ahistoricism Atul described in relation to hurricane paths relates to the much larger cultural phenomena in Houston that Nance identified, where ahistoricism cements the status quo of inequality. In Houston, the town of the prosperity gospel, the refrain I heard over and over again during my fieldwork was that the market is the ultimate arbiter of good and evil. Often, at the end of a list of evasions around the climate conversation, I would be told that if the scientists are right, then the market will respond. This was one instantiation of a zealous cultural attachment to a market-based ideology where all values can be subsumed into price. However, during my fieldwork, I also witnessed even the market's greatest zealots renounce their orthodoxy opportunistically. Quote, "The free market? You have to be joking. After 30 years as a CEO in industry, I have never seen a free market." Scott Sheffield, then CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources, opened an 11-hour hearing before the Texas Railroad Commission on Zoom on April 14th of 2020 as the price of oil sank. The topic was proration, the state government stepping in to cap oil production. At the time, there was a COVID-related collapse in demand during a standoff between OPEC and Russia that anthropologist Ryan Jobson also wrote about from the perspective of Trinidad and Tobago. The same negative shock also required semiotic appeal in Texas. Many of those who spoke at the hearing could be considered wildcatters or small-scale oil and gas producers who have historically championed free market ideologies and railed against government intervention. These wildcatters are who oh, sorry, that part's not important. So several wildcatters made similar arguments. They were supporting proration because they, as small producers, would not be able to survive the acute bust. After several long-winded arguments for or against proration that centered on the existence of the free market, Tom Sanzio, an energy analyst, came on to say, quote, "I thought I was speaking on production, but now I see I'm speaking at a meeting about the soul of Texas. I'm honored." At this hearing, the free market was both the soul of Texas and a freely discarded fiction. Those companies that were big enough to survive the bust said the free market was real and sacred, and those who were small enough and might not survive said that the free market never existed. At the time, the price of oil had not recovered since the 2014 crash, and mainstream investors were hesitant to make new investments in a dying industry. This price drop was not directly climate change related, but it occurred during a period of existential dread in industry. Though the price of oil has since rebounded, the nosedive felt existential enough to these wildcatters for them to renounce their market orthodoxy and beg for government intervention. This offered an ethnographic window where price was the subject of public debate in anthropologist Jane Geyer's framing of composite price. The Texas Railroad Commission chose not to act, and on April 20th, 2020, the price of WTI, West Texas Intermediary crude, hit negative $37 a barrel as storage ran out and producers refused to stop pumping unless the federal government ruled the pandemic an act of God. Only federally recognized God could break the continuous production clause in their long-term land leases. In the drama of price and freefall, market zealots opportunistically reconsidered their belief. Price, the premise of the claim fuel is cheap, was suddenly in human hands. Here, I am not attempting to contrast or cohere professed market beliefs with the theoretical foundations of free market ideology in Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek. Instead, I'm showing you ethnographically what makes people pick up or put down market orthodoxies. 25 years after the Bhopal disaster in India, I sat in the living room of two doctors in South Bombay as the television aired hours of testimony from victims and their families who still had not been compensated or recognized. I was there on a summer internship during college, writing research reports for Slum Dwellers International. A decade later, in 2019, in Houston, I sat across from the sustainability professional I will call Diane at Dow Chemicals, the company that bought Union Carbide after the Bhopal disaster. Throughout my interviews with industry professionals in Houston, I was interested in corporate guilt. I came to see how major companies were defining themselves against their worst failures in a parallel way to how U.S. environmental law is shaped around black swan disasters, as opposed to more preventative frameworks in countries like Norway. Shell and British Petroleum, BP, major European companies are considered the most progressive on climate change issues, but I could not help thinking about the Ogani 9 in Nigeria and the BP oil spill in the Gulf. I was discussing corporate shame with Michael Skelly, a pioneer of wind energy in Texas, and he remarked how on the Exxon campus, the physical bell from Exxon Valdez is in the glory hall. He explained that had to be a decision from the highest level. I found industry professionals acutely aware and proactive about managing their and consumer guilt about the bad things corporations do. Given the opportunity, I always asked about the worst thing my interlocutor's corporation did, in part to assure myself that I was not giving softball interviews. So after discussing how the public misunderstands recycling and how a real circular economy would work from granola wrappers to tractor fuel, I asked Diane about Bhopal. She gave me a long, intellectual, and compassionate but practiced answer. But then she lost steam. Diane looked at me and began, honestly, she was kind of sick of having to answer to the horror of Bhopal. She explained in a higher pitch, a little exasperated and a little embarrassed to be shying away, that, quote, it wasn't us. Diane clarified that Dow Chemicals bought Union Carbide, quote, 7 years later, for cheap. That for cheap rung in my ears. Thousands of people died from the chemical leak at the Union Carbide facility in Bhopal. Why was Union Carbide cheap? Thousands of lives were litigated into externalities, and you can see this in the work of Kim Fortune. My research about Houston tracks how externality as an abstract concept from economic theory is maintained locally in the face of increasingly intense and frequent rain events that have threatened the industrial city. Fossil fuels do work in what they claim to do. They make people and things move really fast. But the key insight to borrow from Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring, is that they do not do so for the price that they claim. My interlocutors in industry shared a range of beliefs about climate change evidence, but the unifying belief that troubled me was that claim: fuel is cheap. I have tried to show the social processes of sense-making and unmaking that make this belief possible. Much like with insecticides, with fossil fuels, the cost calculation is off. In economic terms, there are uncalculated costs. People bear these costs in their bodies, both close to oil infrastructure as documented by environmental justice literature, and far away in scarred landscapes and at the hands of the violence of political regimes held up by US taxpayers to support supposedly private corporations. In Houston, the cost of fossil fuel emissions were negotiated between government agents and residents defining the flooding problem, while fossil fuel companies were careful to remain largely silent, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I argue that the consequential rejection of evidence was not the claim climate change isn't real, but the claim fuel is cheap. This rejection of evidence often included climate change, implicating local industrial actors, but it was not limited to that globe-spanning form of industrial harm. The economic abstraction of externality has to be enforced. It has to be made and maintained over and over again, lived and defended by words and actions that reject human permeability to nature. Externality, a concept essential to the claim fuel is cheap, became harder to defend amidst increasingly perceptible and threatening climate change impacts in Houston. This basic premise upon which market ideologies rely was pushed to the point of absurdity as Houston was submerged over and over again in floodwaters. When I say eat the gorilla, I don't mean eat the rich. I mean learn how the oil industry works and the ways in which American taxpayers subsidize it both financially and by taking the terms of market fundamentalism built around fossil fuels at face value. Unhinge from the foregone conclusions of that claim, cheap fuel. Under the current administration in Washington, a rather blunt version of denial is having a revival across the country. It is no longer perceptive to say that climate change evidence does not lead to climate change action. It is difficult to hold on to truth and identify lies amidst proliferating conspiracy, deepfakes, and brazen falsehoods from the highest offices. Anthropology, for all its flaws, provides a rich arsenal of questions to examine the fragility of beliefs, the contortion of perception across distance, and the everyday of living between seemingly contradictory realities. My book, Selling Swampland to Yankees, is for those who may be wondering how we got here or why those big bad oil men in Texas can't just keep it in the ground. It is also for those very men and women in Texas who may privately doubt the narrative they themselves continue to espouse. It's for all of us making sense of climate change and wondering in sociologist Ulrich Beck's terms, quote, how do we live in the volcano? I hope you will read it, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nataya, for the very rich talk. Now let's open up for questions.
Thank you. Hi, Nataya. Emily DeMeo. Yeah, my question is regarding what are your suggestions for approaching conversations regarding implementation of climate adaptation measures with climate deniers and skeptics, particularly when the deniers have the capacity to be change agents? Given their interests are generally economic in nature, what is the approach when there is no fiscal incentive?
Thank you for that question. I have found that it's important to differentiate if someone is saying a company line or expressing what they actually believe. The fiscal question is obviously more difficult, but I, in both cases, think that the more specific and concrete that you can get, the less people will attach to more ideological forms of resistance, and the less it will be an us-them dynamic. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming, Nataya. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm Emily DeSalvo, first year MRP student. My question for you is a bit about like the nature of your talk, which I thought was like really well written and really engaging. And I'm curious, like when you write a book like that, or if you write a research paper like that, do you incorporate a lot of the story behind your interviews into it? Because for me, I feel like it was helpful to like hear what the conversations were like, but I wasn't sure if that's something that you just included because of this venue or if like you incorporate those sorts of anecdotes into your like articles and books and things like that.
Thank you. So in anthropology, we've spent a lot of time navel gazing, perhaps too much, some might say, but I think it's useful. And my way of representing my own subjectivity in the field was by sort of placing myself in any scene. And I think that's important because I was perceived as a coastal liberal, which is accurate. I'm from Philadelphia, and I would get a different story than someone who was perceived as more of an insider. I wasn't going to hear the kind of like outright denialism or racism that someone more within certain cultures would hear. But I did hear of it both in the gaps or when people would whisper and through sort of hearsay. And occasionally when I went sort of undercover to do observations. But yeah, for me, it's important to the form of knowledge that I'm producing as an anthropologist to make it clear who I am and how I relate to these interlocutors.
Can you speak to which part was undercover? Did you mention that? No, I'm
Well,
curious.
it's illegal for me to be entirely undercover. So like if anyone asks, not illegal, it's against an IRB. But so that would be like at public events that I went to that I didn't necessarily have to say why I was there. So like the Oilfield Christian Services Fellowship luncheon. I had spoken to the director pretty honestly, so it wasn't covert at the institutional level, but in terms of some of the things that I heard, it was less personal and it was less directed at me.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I'm Kritika, a first year MRP student. I was very curious about the method. Like, what are the sort of challenges or barriers that you face when you underscore such a methodology?
Challenge of what was the word used?
Like, what sort of barriers or challenges that you
Barriers.
face when
Okay,
you?
yeah. So for me, I found it really fun to try to make people talk to me that didn't want to talk to me. That was like a really exciting part of research. Some people find that more challenging. I found that I had to be like three times more charming than I was difficult. So I would be exhausted after an interview. And a lot of the people that I was interviewing were engineers and business professionals and lawyers. Less the lawyers, but like a lot of them hadn't spent a lot of time thinking analytically like a liberal arts college class. And so sometimes they really liked our meetings and it would go on for like 2 hours. But I had to retain this like sort of constant charm offensive and also like offer safe stopping points and then ask my more difficult questions. I would say that the difficulties we're gaining access to conservative spaces like the flood control district. That was relatively difficult, and it required leapfrog associations. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I enjoyed the challenge.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm Mariah Richmond. I'm a first year MRP student. I also have a question relating to your interviews, specifically with those like more conservative folks and climate change deniers. I'm wondering how you got them to meet with you in those like one-on-one interviews, what they thought about your research, and if any of them were like worried about how you were going to talk about them or represent them in your work.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I did have to, again, it was like leapfrog. I had to, as you might know, we're in like a space of power in which people have wealth, and some of that wealth is from oil. So I would start with someone in a graduate program whose uncle was an oil man in Texas or whatever, who would agree to talk to me, and then I would go from there if I wanted that type of interview. But in terms of like just county officials and the people in oil and gas, I had to explain to them that I was not a journalist and I was not a legal investigator, that I could not by my IRB threaten their job and therefore was giving an anonymized interview unless they gave explicit consent otherwise. So I was very clear about that. And then as I shared in some of these interviews, I just built trust over time and eventually people said, write whatever you want. And not everyone, but like some people were worried that even like their phrasing could be attributed to them. And so I was careful to note that and not put that in any of my future writing.
Hi, my name is Devi. I have two questions for you. One is your way of presentation was really inspiring. So I wanted to ask you if there is any particular book or author you would suggest that, as planners, we should read definitely about climate change. And my second question is during the interviews, when you go for that, when you prepare for that, you will definitely have expectation that the person you are interviewing is going to speak to you to give you some ideas this way. But like when you interviewed some people, did it happen that it was completely opposite of your expectation, what the answer you got from them?
Thank you. I'm teaching a class called Climate Urbanism, so I have a lot of reading suggestions. I don't know how to pick just one, but one that you guys already read is William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis, which is not explicitly about climate change, but gives a really good foundation for trying to understand climate change in the city. sorry, I just blanked on the question, but I had a good answer. What was the second question?
Second question is, when you went for an interview with the
Oh,
expectation.
surprise. Yeah. Sorry. So that not one Google interview was very funny because that was like usually people higher up in government would give me more canned phrases and the interview would be less interesting. There would be less to write about. But that particular county official was like, took our interview as like a really fun way to vent about anyone and everyone. And I kept like putting the pencil down when it sounded like too gossipy, and just like theatrically to be like, don't worry, I won't like share this part. And he was like, pick your pencil back up, write that down. So yeah, I think I was also surprised at these really conservative people who really didn't want to think about climate change doing things that really could be considered climate action, and that like climate action wasn't necessarily going to look how I imagined it from my coastal and academic spaces.
Thank you.
I guess I'm the next. As somebody who agrees with you that we're not doing nearly enough to confront climate change, and the comment about there's no free market, I agree with. There's no completely free market anywhere, and it probably never has been. But there is a market. And with regard to too much water in particular places, the market worked. The market worked so that, I don't know, 70 years ago, private industry, insurance businesses, stopped writing flood insurance for the most part. So who ignored reality? The government ignored reality. And we have insured people not only to redevelop, but to develop in a lot of places that they shouldn't be developing because the government has not paid attention to what private industry recognized. And that was, you're never going to get your money back if you insure development in places that nature wants to fill with water.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't the larger societal inability to recognize climate change something that's been inherent in many of our decisions as a society for a very long time? The floods that come every 30 years are a whole lot more evident, or 25 years or whatever they come, are a whole lot more evident than climate change. And yet, even with serious flooding, we by and large have ignored what nature is saying to us.
Yes. I agree with what you're saying. I would say there's a little bit that maybe you're missing. There was some interesting research about housing prices, both like in the insured and not insured, like the sort of retail choices about housing is part of any idea of what we might call the market. And that doesn't necessarily respond as clearly to data as maybe insurance rates have in your reading. But yeah, I think that's largely true. I'm not sure what the question was exactly.
Well, but again, the private industry by and large refuses to write flood insurance. All right. And most flood insurance is available to regular citizens, comes from is a result of a government subsidized program.
Right.
And so
in
we
California
as a
as well as in
people have been
Texas,
ignoring common sense with regard to water for a very long time on many, many levels.
Yes, but I think in the response to that truth, there are very different strategies for different neighborhoods, for different cities. Like there's a lot of subjectivity after that realization.
Thank you.
Hi, Nataya, Nikhil. My question is about the threshold mentality that you mentioned about with these executives. So I don't know, maybe in your literature review and in your fieldwork experience, like, could you have you made what was your assessment of it? Like, I don't know, global cases, the case from Texas, what's the mentality like, and how is it evolving? And depending on these people, I mean, the kind of political spectrum they belong to, can you have a comment on that?
Sure. I mean, there's like a lot of anthropological literature that in my other writing I would go into that I didn't go into this talk about risk projections and about thinking about climate risk and nuclear risk and these long time spans, and then the mismatch of sort of political decision-making timelines. So in that way, I mean, like I asked my students, how far into the future do you care about? And one of them said like, oh, my grandchildren. And one of them said like, I can't think more than a month into the future. So like, I think that even though I wouldn't phrase those sort of, I wouldn't phrase climate risk in terms of that kind of like threshold of 5 to 10. I think that it's a real challenge to make sense of climate change in a place and plan infrastructure and gain popular support and funding for it. And the way that you do that determines who benefits and who loses out from that infrastructure. So I think that like convincing people to believe in climate change or not is somewhat secondary to what you actually want to make in response to that knowledge. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I just want to have a second question, which is about like, have you like come across cases like globally where the same pattern that you see, like like engineers and people who makes key decisions on like floodwater management fail to do this because they are still waiting. So, I just have some examples from India which kind of reflect the same thing that you mentioned about Houston. So I just wanted to see like it's like a global case, with all these officials, yeah.
I mean, yeah, a lot of engineers in many cities across the globe are responsible for floodwater management and in that way for responding to climate change on some level. I have a good friend, Dean Shahim, who writes about flood management in Mexico City, and he talks about these engineers choosing which neighborhoods to flood, which amount using the tunnels under Mexico City. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to speak to this example in Houston, but I thought about a lot of other examples while I was doing my field work, and I hope to be in conversation with other case studies.
Hi, Nataya. Great talk. I'm Julian, a first-year MRP. I'm wondering a bit more about the motives for climate change denialism among different camps and how that differed depending on the position of the people you interviewed. So, for example, for officials you interviewed with access to overwhelming amounts of data in support of climate change, you mentioned some officials who still trusted a lot of and used a lot of the NOAA data despite also denying climate change. What did you see sort of some of the underlying motives for denialism being? Was it profit? Was it sort of the existential dread that comes along with acknowledging climate change? Was it being entrenched in certain political ideologies and the misinformation that comes along with that? I'm just curious how you see those motives differing across different groups.
Sure, thank you. I think there was like in an acute way that mentioning climate change changes who pays for what flood infrastructure and would influence the oil and gas industry to pay for infrastructure that would protect them, like their infrastructure along the Houston Ship Channel. And industry people were very aware of that. I mean, after Hurricane Harvey, Shell gave an executive on loan to run the recovery process, and they were very involved in managing the conversation at that stage when they could act like a hero. And then in the longer time span, I think that what I found was an industry that was worried about an energy transition and worried about the confidence in their industry and their ability to fundraise. And climate change was a downer. Like it would make it seem like that was sooner. So the more they could avoid that kind of conversation in public, the more that they could buoy confidence in an industry that wasn't necessarily performing along its own metrics.
For public officials who weren't necessarily directly driven by the profit motive of being in oil and gas, though, were they still driven by the overall want for like profitability and economic success within the state of Texas or within the Houston area? Or were there different motivations when they weren't directly informed by a profit motive?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were obviously a range of motivations, and this is something I sat with a lot. But I think that in a place like Houston that's been so dominated by the oil and gas industry, where 50% of the economy, most people work in oil and gas or a related field, there is like a clear sense, more than in my upbringing in Philadelphia, that their like relative success in Houston goes with the price of oil. And so there was a protectiveness of the industry, even from people who weren't directly in it, because there was an acute sense that taxes were based off of property taxes without an income tax. And like, there was just a sense that their life and livelihood was indirectly connected to the success of an industry that was seen as having provided a certain way of life.
Great, thank you so much. It's fascinating.
Hi, Nataya. I really enjoyed your talk. My name's Oliver. I'm a URS student, an undergrad, and I wanted to ask you based on all the interviews, which were so interesting to hear, do you feel more or less confident about the future of climate change prevention, or less, or I should say just flood prevention in Houston after your time there? Maybe you can kind of like give a perspective of what you felt going into your research. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I felt a little bit more confident in that responding to climate change didn't rest on changing all of someone's cultural values or their worldview, but on sort of focusing more locally and connecting experiential knowledge to climate data, even if you didn't call it that. Yeah, I wasn't that hopeful of like who was going to pay for the infrastructure. That seemed like it was still going to be borne largely by taxpayers, especially in a place where the conversation could be controlled in the way that I perceived it to be in Houston. And how do I feel now? It's hard. But my research was during the last Trump administration, which was definitely different. But there was still like a sense in Houston, the city full of engineers, that they didn't want to be so intensely anti-science as the Trump administration and the sort of outright censorship that was going on. So there was like a sort of different thing where like oil men in Texas think they're doing the dirty work for your nice SUVs in California or whatever. There's like it's a different obstinance than this sort of top level federal denialism that we're seeing right now.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I am Abhiram from first year MRP. Texas is a national leader, or maybe even a global leader, in terms of renewable energy production. Also, they've got like vast amounts of solar and wind power installed and ongoing. So, what was the industry, oil and gas industry, response to that, or maybe their thoughts on Texas being known for oil and gas at the same time racing ahead in terms of renewable production as well?
Thank you. Yeah, so that was something I tracked really heavily in the field that wasn't really in this presentation, but at the time of my research, it was already the biggest wind producer in the country, and I interviewed someone who was very involved in that, Michael Skelly, who was the one who talked about Exxon Valdez. Yeah, I found that when people were not wanting to talk about climate change in public, in private, there was a lot of backdoor conversations going on, trying to build a new narrative for the city, trying to rebrand industries, not as oil and gas, but as energy companies, and to rebrand Houston as the energy capital of the world, not the oil and gas capital of the world. And so while during especially the beginning of my research, people didn't really want to talk about how much wind was being produced in Texas, once they had a narrative that they felt they could sell, a narrative of optimism for the business community in Houston, then they started saying more. And one thing that's interesting about Houston that people don't always remember is that Enron was a Houston story. And Enron was a company that was about renewables and was about trading renewables and non-renewables in Houston. And the role that I found oil and gas industry people trying to sell for a Houston through an energy transition was really a revived version of Enron, like being what some of them called energy merchants. And so that brought like two kinds of responses: skepticism because of Enron's catastrophic failure, but then also it's sort of like a familiarity. So it was complicated, but more conversations were happening behind closed doors than outside of them.
Please join me to thank Nataya again for this incredible talk.
Thank you so much for all of your questions.